you wouldn't treat your animals like that. If you had a horse that was in a stall behind your house, and you go back there and it's just the flesh is gone from its body and you can see bones exposed, I mean, you wouldn't even treat your animal like that.
Found dead and fused into the family's couch.
The parents let their daughter die in deplorable conditions.
What was left of her rotting 100-pound body was found embedded, melted into a couch.
When police entered this home in Louisiana, they didn't find a crime scene. They found a nightmare. A woman literally melted into a couch where she had been sitting for 12 straight years. This is Lacey Fletcher. While she was starving and fusing into the fabric of her own living room, her parents were eating dinner, going to work, and living a normal life. Just a few feet away. How does a human being disappear in plain sight? And why did it take over a decade for someone to finally open the door?
It was just an extraordinary situation. Paramedics showed up at her house last January, and they found her literally melted into the couch, covered in feces, looked like her hair hadn't been brushed for years, totally neglected. The coroner's office ruled that she was totally neglected. She was literally fused to the sofa. This as her parents were coming and going, living normal lives, going to work. Meanwhile, they have their daughter who had not gotten up from the sofa in what the coroner estimates was possibly years.
To understand the tragedy of Lacey Fletcher, we have to look back at the girl she once was. Born in 1985 in the small, quiet town of Slaughter, Louisiana, Lacey was described by those who knew her as a bright, sweet, and social child. Growing up as an only child to Sheila and Clay Fletcher, she was the center of their world. In her early school years, Lacey was like any other teenager. She played volleyball at the local high school and was known for her kind spirit. There was nothing in her early life that suggested she would one day become the subject of one of the most horrifying cases in medical history.
She had a condition called Asperger's syndrome, and so essentially it was just kind of a situation where she became more and more reclusive. A lot of the neighbors told us as we began covering the story, they used to see her outside playing, and then all of a sudden they stopped seeing her as she got older. And so they just thought that maybe she had moved on and moved away. But turns out she was living right there in her parents' living room, and that's where she died, unfortunately, as well.
However, as Lacey reached her mid-teens, something shifted. She began to struggle with severe social anxiety and was eventually diagnosed with a form of autism. In the 9th grade, her parents made the decision to pull her out of school to be homeschooled, citing her inability to cope with the social environment. From that moment, the door to the outside world slowly began to close. For the next 20 years, Lacey Fletcher was rarely, if ever, seen by her neighbors or friends. She became a ghost in her own home, while behind those closed doors, a slow and unimaginable nightmare was just beginning to unfold.
They found sofa material, they found feces in her stomach. I mean, she was literally just sitting in this pool of rot, just fused there and just left for dead. In the 16 years that I've covered news here in the Baton Rouge community, I've never seen anything like it. When we talked to the coroner, he's been doing this over 40-something years in that parish. He said he's never seen anything like it. So when you think that another human being could leave a loved one or a family member in this type of condition, it really makes you just question what their, what was going on with them. Did they have something going on in their minds to think that this could be normal? And the fact that they could live a normal life outside of the fact that their daughter's rotting away, dying on the sofa. They were going to church, to work, to the grocery store. I mean, just living like you and I would live as normal citizens on a day-to-day basis.
For the next 2 decades, Lacey Fletcher became a memory to the outside world. While her parents, Sheila and Clay, remained active and well-respected members of the Slaughter community, Sheila even serving as a town alderman, Lacey was nowhere to be seen. Neighbors occasionally asked about her, only to be told the same vague story. Lacey is doing fine, she's just struggling with her mental health. But behind those walls, the reality was far more sinister. There were no medical professionals visiting the house, no social workers checking in, and no one to witness the slow, agonizing physical and mental decline of a woman who had been completely abandoned by the very people sworn to protect her.
So we spoke with a lot of neighbors when we started investigating this situation, and they said the last time that they went into that house was probably about 15 years ago. So that was about the time that it stopped. When she stopped going outside and became a recluse and just went into the house, that's when they kind of stopped allowing visitors to come in. But you can only imagine what it was like. The fact that she just rotted into the sofa. They said all the wood floors inside were buckling from feces and urine. They said just the stench permeating throughout that house was just a smell they will never forget.
As the years bled into each other, Lacey's world shrank to the dimensions of a single room, and eventually to a single piece of furniture, a worn-out leather sofa in the living room. Reports later suggested that Lacey hadn't left that spot in years. She lived, ate, and slept in the same position, while her body began to fuse with the material of the couch itself. The air in the house remained still, the curtains remained drawn, and a heavy, dark secret was festering in the heart of the Fletcher home, waiting for the inevitable day when the authorities would finally be called to witness the unthinkable.
When I got there, the officers, the first responders on scene were just in a daze. They were just standing there. They were on the outside. When I walked in, the house smelled of a stench it smelled like a sewer, a septic tank, and also a smell of death. I've never smelled that in my life. I've dealt with decomposed bodies. I've dealt with all sorts of death, degradation, whatever. Never experienced this in all of my career.
On the morning of January 3rd, 2022, a 911 call came in from the Fletcher residence that would haunt the first responders for the rest of their lives. Sheila Fletcher calmly reported that her daughter, Lacey, had stopped breathing. When the paramedics arrived, they weren't prepared for the sight or the smell that awaited them. There, in the middle of the living room, they found Lacey's body. She was partially submerged in a hole in the leather sofa, a hole that had been worn through the foam and wood over years of neglect. The scene was so horrific that the local coroner, Dr. Ewell Bickham, later stated it was a case of murder by neglect, unlike anything he had seen in his 20-year career.
When I walked through the door, to the right of me in the kitchen, Clay and Sheila Fletcher were standing there. Clay was standing there emotionless. The mom had her head between her knees. I saw a tear or two. To the left was the living room where Lacey was. I immediately went through there. I didn't stop and socialize with the parents. I went in there to where Lacey was.
The news sent shockwaves through the community of Slaughter. How could a prominent family, known for their church-going ways and local leadership, allow their daughter to literally waste away in plain sight? As the investigation deepened, forensic evidence revealed the true scale of the horror. Lacey had not received medical care for 2 decades. She was found in a state of extreme malnutrition, suffering from severe infections and conditions that were entirely preventable. The question on everyone's mind was no longer what happened, but how. How could 2 parents live in the same house for years while their daughter suffered such an unimaginable fate just feet away from them?
And like I said, I've seen every kind of death there is. I've seen elderly people die of natural causes. I've seen suicides, homicides. I've seen everything there is. I've never seen a homicide like this. I have never seen an individual, a human being, literally tortured and allowed to die while she is alive. I've never seen that in my life. I've seen decomposed bodies of someone that drowns. You find the body a week later. That's one thing, and they're decomposed. Lacey did not decompose. She rotted in her own body in that hole, in that sewer in the couch.
When Dr. Ewell Bickham began his examination, he discovered a reality that was difficult to process. Lacey Fletcher's body hadn't just been found on the sofa, it was fused to it. The medical report revealed that she had developed severe deep pressure ulcers that had reached her bones, causing a fatal case of sepsis. But the most haunting detail was the sofa itself. Over the years, Lacey's body had worn a literal hole through the leather and foam, leaving her submerged in her own waste. According to Bickham, it appeared she had not been moved, cleaned, or cared for in over a decade. It was, in his professional opinion, a case of chronic, long-term torture through neglect.
It is. There were insect droppings, rodent, mouse droppings all over on the mantle near the fireplace. But talking about her legs being crossed, basically because of her condition, and this has been years, her legs were crossed because they were in contractures. What we call contractures. The muscles, tendons, bones just become so immobile from not being moved that they just stiffen and they stay that way. And she was like that in that position because she was in so much pain that she was trying to lift her body out of that hole because it hurt, it stung, it was horrible. She didn't have the energy to lift her body out of that hole.
The autopsy further revealed that Lacey suffered from extreme malnutrition, weighing barely 96 pounds at the time of her death. There was evidence of osteomyelitis, a painful bone infection, and maggots were found on the scene, indicating the level of decay she lived in while still alive. Dr. Bickham stated that this wasn't a sudden tragedy. It was a slow, agonizing decline that took place right under the noses of her parents. His findings provided the crucial evidence needed for the grand jury to bring second-degree murder charges against Sheila and Clay Fletcher.
The only thing I saw was a small bag of hard candy, some type of like butterscotch or just candy, peppermint type candy. And that was it. That's the only nourishment she probably had, because I'll just not try to be too graphic, but in her stomach, she had the yellow foam from the sofa and feces. So you take it from there.
Following the horrifying discovery, Sheila and Clay Fletcher were arrested and charged with second-degree murder. The case dragged on for years due to legal maneuvers and debates over their daughter's mental state. In a shocking turn of events, the parents initially had their charges dropped due to a technicality, only to be re-indicted by a grand jury shortly after. Finally, in 2024, they entered a no-contest plea to manslaughter. The world watched in disbelief as the two people responsible for Lacey's decades of suffering were sentenced to 40 years in prison, with 20 years suspended. This means they may only serve a fraction of the time Lacey spent trapped in that living room. The story of Lacey Fletcher remains a haunting reminder of how silence and neglect can be more lethal than any weapon. Lacey spent 2 decades as a ghost in her own home, while her parents lived a normal life just steps away. As Sheila and Clay Fletcher begin their sentences, the world is left with the memory of a sweet, social girl who was completely abandoned when she needed help the most. Her story is a stain on the soul that will never be forgotten. If this story touched you, don't forget to like and subscribe for more deep dives into the most mysterious cases in history. This has been Verdict Prime, and we'll see you in the next investigation.